This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Today, we have part 2 of a 2-part conversation. I highly suggest you go back, download, and listen to part 1 of this fascinating discussion. Don't worry, we'll be waiting for you beyond the big screen. The movie kind of fades out in the ending. It has a really key scene towards the end that's really painful for the writer, where his wife, I don't think it might actually not be his wife, it's his girlfriend, dies. And the captain, the Stasi captain, tries to stop it, but it's kind of like one of those, the whole thing where you get the taste of like, there's nothing that's going to stop any of this. But they do have a scene where the Stasi captain, he's been demoted and he's in a basement somewhere, and the wall falls, and his friend hears it on his radio, and he's like, oh yeah, the wall falls, or something to that effect, and he just walks off the job. Like, what was it like in those?
I remember he says die Mauer ist offen, which is like, every time I hear that sentence, it's just like, so I think, anybody that grew up in Germany, or like the wall is open, it's just like, that's just one of the most powerful sentences you can say in German. Like, just like anyways, sorry. and I remember it as, as a piece of history that as a 10-year-old or whatever, I was like, you knew that this was something that was history when it was happening. That I think that even if you were something of an age where you knew that what was going on and onward, that this was something that was really big that was happening. What was it like to be right there when this happened? That's the thing, is like, I was definitely too young to know exactly what was fully understand that, but my dad was so excited. And my dad is not a history buff. He's a traditional nerd. Like, he's a software engineer. He doesn't care about kings and dates and all that. I got that from my mom. But he was so excited. I come out of school and he's sitting there. He's in the street with his, waiting there in his car, and he like honks and he's like, Justin, Travis, get in. And we jump in the car, and we're still in our Fasching costumes, our carnival. It was like late February, so that's how I know it must have been February of 1990. It was like I'm dressed up like a clown, but the clothes that I happened to have was an American flag as a vest, and like I had stars and stripes on the pants and stuff, and it was kind of goofy looking, like it was all too big and weird, but then it ended up being like super perfect, because it was like, oh, we're going up to tear the wall down, like, let's go be some patriots. And and he was just so excited that I picked up on that. Like, it was just like, what is happening? Like, something great is about to happen, and it was so exciting. It was just so exciting. When your parents are just like, oh, we're going to Disneyland, you don't even know what that is, but you're like, oh my goodness, it's going to be
let's do it.
Let's do it. Let's go. And it was like that. It's like, we're going to Disneyland, but we weren't. We were going to go see, the free East Berlin. And we get up there, and somewhere he bought a couple of hammers and chisels for 5 marks, and I still have the pieces of the Berlin Wall that I chipped away myself. And at some point there was already gaps in the wall, and you could look across, and at that point you could that's the most drastic you'd ever see it. It was one side was just full of color, billboards and advertising and graffiti. Even on the west side of the wall is covered in graffiti. On the east side is like, you get close to it, you get shot. So the color is just the color is missing. As a 9-year-old, that's what I picked up on, is like, hey, there's no graffiti over here, and there's no billboards over here, and all the Trabants only come in a couple of colors, so it's like black, white, beige, gray, and that's it. And you come over there, the other way is like, there's red golfs and blue golfs and green golfs and a lot of VWs, sure, but color. I mean, that was just something that a 9-year-old can definitely like, that's weird. Like, it's the Wizard of Oz kind of thing. Like, that's color, that's black and white. What's happening? Even, if you think about it, like, there's a couple less blue jeans. There's a couple, people are just wearing like these, brown and black overcoats. If you like, that's the traditional kind of, European style. But
but you might also see a Nike jacket and a Puma jacket on the other side, which you wouldn't see as much of in East Germany. So, oh yeah, I picked up on that, and I gotta say, that experience, that one day in my life was like clearly pivotal in because then like me trying to answer the question of my trying to find the answer to the question of like, why was my dad so excited, and what did I witness that day, and what was that all about, and what is up with East Germany, and all of that really sparked my love of history. Like I was growing up in Munich, and it's like, well, Germany's split because World War II. What? And then at some point you figure out like, oh, I live in Hitler's favorite city. Like Munich is Hitler's favorite city, and you're like, well, what? And you just these questions keep coming, and trying to answer those satisfactorily, like is why I still read that stuff. It's why I still like history. After college, I moved 2 weeks after college without having a job, without having a place to stay. I had 2 nights in a hotel booked. I went over to Prague and bought a return ticket because I didn't think I'd make it, and then stayed there for 10 years. And part of that was like, I was in Prague once at 2005, and it was less wealthy than Berlin. It was still old and gritty, and that's what I wanted to see. I was like, I knew it was going to get lost, and that's what I wanted to see. I'd been in Berlin a couple times since then, and it changes it's a totally new city every decade since the fall of the wall. Berlin is now, but it took longer, and I still got a glimpse of the old when I moved there. Now every pile of rubble is a beautiful cafe or something, but an amazing transformation just the last couple of years. It really was a crazy world, like broken down houses and old buildings that were too bourgeoisie to fix, but too historically important to tear down, and just things crumbling, and scaffolds on front of cathedrals because of what I just said. So just weird. The whole city was in limbo with the government just having this ideological crisis of what to do and how to fix things, and they couldn't, and they lost.
That's the movie. It had a poignant ending that after the wall fell, this Dryman character is trying to figure himself out and figure out, I guess, how probably millions of East Germans and Eastern Europeans in general were trying to do. They were trying to figure themselves out, and they progressively had scenes of 2 years later, about 5 or 6, rather 3 or 4 of them. So it was it went from about 2 years after to about 8 years after. Progressively, what was it like? I mean, right after the fact, you figure. One question I had is, what happened to the actual wall that you figure a wall is splitting a city in half that was at one point together, then it's separated, and then how does those two pieces meld back together?
It's interesting. So a couple of things happened after the war. One thing they showed in the movie is that the guy decided to get his hands on the Stasi file, which very interestingly, all East Germans could then do. They could then, and which is not the case in the Czech Republic. This is not the case in definitely not the case in Russia, believe you me. But East Germany, because then the West German government took over completely, and they were like, clean break. Communism was bad. We are now, and don't worry, it's in the past. We are now doing this. And what this means is the West German way, period. It was just, that's it. And the SED was dissolved and, broke up into, founded new parties and this and that. And some of them just went to the SPD and other parties. The SED is the single communist party of East Germany. And it was just weird. So what many people did is they got their file to say like, oh, well, what did the Stasi actually find on me, or what did they actually do? And in his file, he's like, oh my goodness, they actually went into my apartment, and that's not possible. And then some guy at some point tells him, oh, you don't think that, you don't think we observed your apartment? Check behind your light switches. And sure enough, he goes home, and then he starts to dig, and then he finds out who that guy was, and there's one of the themes is like forgiveness. So he dedicates his book to him because he realizes he saves him. And I don't want to spoiler too many things. Yeah, so what do the citizens do? How do the citizens heal? And I can tell you the citizens are traumatized. I can tell you from living in Prague and now knowing several East Germans that it was a tear. They got ripped out of their lives and into a new one. And while we all celebrated in the West, they had to find new jobs for which they were woefully underqualified for. People lost their, less in Germany, but like in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, people lost their pensions. And now what? You know, you're 70 years old. What happens? That communist social net was gone. And so people just like kind of torn into a capitalist society that they weren't ready for. And that was one of the things, like, you know, get over the past by figuring out what the Stasi did to you and, you know, that sort of healing. And there was a lot of that happened, and there's still grudges. You still see people that were in the Communist Party at the supermarket in Prague, for instance. You know, it's Czech Republic's 10 million people. Prague is 1.3. So, you know, you'd see someone in parliament or whatever that, you know, might have, I mean, they're still there. It's not like a denazification. They're still, well, even then, there was no denazification, to be honest. They're still there. And so the whole point is that how do you get past that? And then the other side of that is like, well, the city itself changed so drastically. I could tell a couple of stories just to give people like, you know, some perspective is, so I was there in 89 and I could tell you there's the Panelaks, the Plattenbauten, which is, what does that mean? That's the old communist, it's like, it looks like the projects. It's just these communist buildings, like thrown up apartment blocks that are hideously ugly and no paint, just, you know, concrete. And you see those, and then some of those start getting torn down. You see newer places, or they start getting fixed up or whatever. But Berlin, so I was there, I have one story from 2000. I was 18 years old and I went there for Easter. It was a long weekend, and I had a fantastic weekend. They had organized a whole lamb and we roasted it over a pit. So, you know, someone was like, I was the guy for some time, but, you know, we took turns like rotating this lamb for like 13 hours or something all day. And we brought up a bunch of Bavarian beer, and they were like, oh, you got Augustina. And it turns out, so, you know, I go to this place, my friend goes there, my friend brings me there, and his brother lives there. And it turns out, like, it kind of dawns on me over time that these are squatters. And at first I'm like, nah, that can't be, because it's hundreds of them living in this apartment block, not a communist one. This was an old pre-war part of Berlin, which it's hard to describe that architecture, but you have a facade to the street, and then you might have like 4 or 5 apartments building in a row behind that, like away from the street. So like in World War II, when Berlin was getting bombed, it was like, you might not have street access. It's just a weird city. There's all these like unique things about Berlin that make Berlin Berlin. But in this case, I was with all these squatters, and because there's only one front door, it's kind of like a fortress. So the cops can't just like come in and kick out all the squatters, because there's hundreds of them, and there's one front door, and it's barricaded, and it's like, well, that's interesting. I went to a bar where, you know, there's the basement window that might just be in the sidewalk. Well, they took that off, and then so it was literally a hole in the ground, not a hole in the wall, but it was a hole in the ground, and you slip through, and then there's these guys in like, you know, mohawks and, you know, dyed red dreads or whatever, or all of the above, like a mohawk of dyed red dreads. And, you know, they got beer on tap and they're smoking joints and stuff. And you're just like, well, wow, this is insane. Now, that's East Berlin, because those are anarchists. Those are like the leftist, the punks. That's the punk scene that is now dead. But that, you know, that was that scene. And they were the anti-communists in the communist day. They were still around, different generation, but they were the anti-government, you know, pro-democracy type. And now they're the anti-capitalist. Like, ironically, they kind of switched sides a little bit. And they're the leftists, but not communists, you know. Yeah, it's really, so, you know, European political, because when you figure it out, you realize it's not a spectrum, it's a circle, where totalitarianism is one end. It doesn't matter if it's fascism or communism. And then it circles around to left and right, and they meet in the center. But, Yeah, so these hippies are just against totalitarianism. They're like, well, just let us be free. They're liberals in the traditional sense of the word. So they're anti-communists when communists are intrinsic, in like squeezing their freedoms, and they're anti-capitalists when it's the West Berliners telling them what to do. So and they were squatters, and I didn't really realize until they're like, oh yeah, pick any room, and there's a sleeping bag, and I'm like, pick any room? What? And there was no furniture anywhere. There was graffiti everywhere. The whole place was kind of falling apart. I was told to not drink the water, and that kind of thing. Like in Germany, And that's gone. I went back and I went up that road in 2015, just a couple of years ago, and it's beautiful part of town, all cleaned up. There's no punks bartering in a courtyard. There's definitely no one roasting a lamb in a courtyard. So yeah, I mean I fell in love with Berlin in the 2000s. The last year I really lived in Munich was like 2000, 2001, and Berlin just must have been my favorite city. I mean, it's just amazing, and I have all these stories from former East Berlin, and that's a whole nother thing now. I still love Berlin. It's still one of my favorite cities, and the people you meet from there are still just some of the most, just friendly, outgoing Germans you'll ever meet. That's for sure. And it's a metropolitan city, and it always has been. It was at the center of the Cold War. Kennedy going there, telling the world he's a Berliner, to, the airlift, to, I'm going to go to Nuremberg in October. I'm going to remind them of all these things before I talk about like whatever, Marilyn Monroe or something, for my Americana show. But Berlin has just always been, pre-Nazi days was a jazz hub. Like in the 30s, it was just, it shared the roaring 20s with us, and they loved American music. And it's just way up there on my list of cities. And this movie is a dark chapter of it, but a fascinating one. And it's neat to know that this movie really was all filmed in Berlin. A lot of these movies cheat and film in the Czech Republic, where it's more of that communist stuff is still preserved. But this one was really, it was actually filmed in the old building that was used by the Stasi, for instance, is one of the locations.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors.
Throughout the movie, they showed a couple of really key parts of East Berlin, and one was the Hohenschönhausen, which was the capital, or the headquarters, rather, of the East German Communist Ministry of State Security, also known as the Stasi. These different locales in East Germany, have they preserved them to some degree? Is there something of East Germany that's recognizable to pre-1989?
What's the name of that? Not Alexanderplatz. That's the main square. There's one of the. It actually has like a Russian-sounding name, even though that's just East Prussian. But it's like a. What's it called? There's one park in Berlin that's actually huge. It's massive, and it was It's a war memorial to the fallen Red Army soldiers in the capturing of Berlin in World War II, and because it's a memorial, because it's but it's like creepy. So it's super Soviet Union. It was built by Stalin, in Stalinist times, which means it even has a mosaic of like these saints-looking figures, but they're not saints; they're like generals. And you see like Molotov, and you see Stalin in the middle, kind of like with almost a halo around them. And it's a mosaic. I mean, it really looks like an Orthodox cathedral type or like a chapel type of thing. But that's the mass graves for the soldiers, and of course you can't tear that kind of thing down. So there's still cemeteries that were done up by the Red Army, or like the Red Army cemeteries, same as in Prague, and same as in all those villages, and a lot of places it's disappearing. So in a lot of places they preserve it, period, and it's always going to be there. You asked about the Berlin Wall earlier. There's a Berlin Wall museum right by Checkpoint Charlie where they kept part of it, and like this is what it looked like. And then you see sections of it because it was in these concrete panels, and there's sections of it like all over the world. Like every embassy it's a sign of peace now. This thing that used to tear us apart is now joining us together, and so it's given away as dignitaries, and people get pieces of like Reagan famously got pieces of the Iron Curtain from Gorbachev, and is that right, Reagan or Bush? But those kind of famous stories. So it's a token now. But the wall's still around. It's torn down most of the city, but sometimes they'll put a marker where it used to be, like just a white line saying that, this is separated east from west, which is weird because it's right in the middle of neighborhoods, in the middle of streets, and you really get a sense of like, wow, this split the city. This split neighbor from neighbor. Even road numbers on a street were West Berlin, odd numbered houses were East Berlin, and it just made no sense. But yeah, it's all still there. It's a visible scar that Germans are good at preserving that kind of thing because they kind of figured out, this whole philosophical conversation happened after World War II. And so now it's kind of like, let's never forget this happened. And, the victims of socialism can heal through these memorials and that kind of thing. When I first moved to Czech Republic, I of course, instantly, as a big beer aficionado, wanted to go to the city of Budweis, which is called České Budějovice in Czech, and which is where Budweiser comes from. That's the original. That's Budweis. It's a Czech town. And I go there, and in the Old Town Square, the police building, you could see where they had taken down the Red Star. And I went back a couple of years later, and they had painted over the whole thing, and you couldn't tell anymore. But so when I still moved there, and obviously for years after in East Germany, you could see the scars of communism. And they're trying harder and harder to hide them or like decide, do we keep this as a memorial or hide it? And those are happening in courts all over Eastern and Central Europe on a case-by-case basis, and things are crumbling and things are being preserved. Some of the most obvious things were torn down. Like the biggest Stalin statue in the world was in Prague. That was torn down in the 50s by Khrushchev. So even amongst themselves, they couldn't always agree on, what was good and what was overbearing and what was, too much. Like Stalin was then seen as a bad character and all his stuff was taken down. So, it's weird. Even during communism, things changed. After communism was like a shock, a tidal wave of the West forcing their way on the East in a way. But the East also wanting to what is all this stuff we've been missing out on for 40 years? And then I would say, every 10 years it's been a different city. I left Prague 2015. I moved there in 2005. Prague was a different city. I left, then I moved. Just the trams. There's the old communist trams, and now they're all replaced with the new Skoda trams. So, I loved it every day to go into work and be like, you get into a communist era tram, a streetcar, and it's kind of a constant reminder of oh my goodness, I'm in the East. This is kind of crazy. This is kind of exotic. This is kind of an adventure. And now it's that Skoda tram that is just a couple of years old, that could be in Munich, that could be in Paris or London or Venice or Vienna. It's all super modern, super Western. Pilsner is sold here at the local shop, so it's Coca-Cola's obviously you can buy there. So yeah.
And now people don't want to drink Coca-Cola because it's full of carbs and sugar.
It's already bad. Yeah, and it's exactly, yeah, Marlboro cigarettes and Coca-Cola are things we look down upon, McDonald's and those things. And it's crazy the way the world changes, the way that they perceive everything. And if you turn on the Czech radio, not so much East Germany perhaps, but if you turn on probably in the villages and such, if you turn on Czech radio, it is schizophrenic as far as you'll hear Michael Jackson, or let's say Madonna or Prince or whatever, some 80s pop song next to the newest Jay-Z, uncensored with the F-bombs and the blasphemy and everything, and then a country tune or something, and then you'll hear a Beatles song but translated to Czech. Because in communist times, that was a big industry. They would take all the Elvis songs, translate them all to Czech, because then it would be okay. You could play them on the radio, but not the American, not Elvis, heaven forbid. But Czechless is fine, and the Czech Beatles were fine. So they had these bands that just dubbed, synchronized all these songs into Czech, made them rhyme, made it somehow made sense. And you still hear that because people are fans of those things. So you'll hear Karl Gottwald is still around. He might have died, I don't know, but he was a Czech superstar, and he was a superstar before and after. He's old now, but And he was super controversial because people were like, he should have taken a stronger stance against communism, or, this and that. And he survived. He became famous afterwards. Like, he survived the whole change. And so you'll hear a Karl Gott song, which was popular in the 70s after Madonna, right before Jay-Z, after like Hank Williams, like, some weird, or a Czech version of a Hank Williams song. Like, it's just so weird. Like, and why? It's because to them, everything came out in 1989. 1989 is the year when every song ever came out, from Elvis to, Chuck Berry came out in 1989. You didn't know that? It's just Rolling Stones came out in 1989. That's the year when it all flooded in and they could just listen to whatever they wanted to, as loud as they wanted to, and everything was instantly available. Czechs and Slovaks became very good at bootlegging already from communist days, but they were also some of the very first to just have their own totally private networks, like they would make their own internet service providers, is the right way to look at it. So you'd have like these cabled networks going from building to building that wasn't necessarily part of the normal internet. It's just a it's part of the deep web, I guess, and they would just have movies, and if you want any subtitle for any movie ever, it does exist in Slovak and Czech, because the Slovaks, they just went off on that. It's just one of the things they became very, very good at in the 90s, was like, we want to know everything, and no one spoke English, and so a small group of people came together, and it is amazing how many movies they subtitled. And you can just download almost any movie, and almost any movie has Czech subtitles for it. You just plug them in, and it's a weird part of that culture. There's a lot of techies over there, because there's a lot of tech companies over in Prague, because they were just really interested in that in the 90s. And you have kids graduating college today, 2017, learning assembler and COBOL for like IBM mainframes. Like, no kidding. Like, that's why I had my job over there, was, because that doesn't exist here. Here they're all 60 years old looking to retire, and you got 23-year-olds programming an assembler. Like, that doesn't make any sense, except for that's Eastern Europe for you. Everything came out in 89. They have a whole different timeline than we do, like, as far as what happened.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors.
It's interesting you bring it up, a 23-year-old. Now we're getting on to 30 years after the wall fell. What is it like for this? There's a group of people who are coming into age now who are completely post-1989. They were born after 1989. Yeah. Their whole worldview is post-1989. What is that like?
So it's a horrible, it's a traumatic, it's a depressing thing to understand what happened after Nazi Germany and what happened after the fall of the Iron Curtain. Is when you start to understand the generation gap, the difference between father and son, you start to hear these heart-wrenching stories, or these like traumatic, like these broken family stories, because World War II was far, far worse. Let me put it that way. Like, that's for sure. And, what do you do when it dawns on you that your father was in the SS, or that your father was in the, heaven forbid, like one of the, like on the front, like one of the Einsatzgruppen, chasing down Jews in Ukraine or something. Like, what do you do when you realize that that's who your father was, and you yourself are like, totally the other side of the spectrum, like totally enlightened, Nazis are evil, and all this. But how do you deal with that? And then how do you deal with that if your father is not apologetic? How do you deal with that if your father's not repentant? What do you do if your father swallowed the propaganda? And I've seen with my own two eyes. I'm a first person account. I've seen this happen in Germany with Nazi propaganda, where I've had people tell me of course we attacked Poland because they were shooting at us first, and we just, defended our borders. And I was like, yeah, no, that was the radio transmission in 1939, but that's not actually what happened. Like, is that really what you think? And this was told to me in 2010 or something. and it's like, whoa, that's, and his brother was in the SS, but his brother was shot in the war, so he had a picture of an SS guy hanging in his living room. Well, but I mean, it's such a. And then I was speaking to his grandchildren, and he's like, "Oh, did my grandpa say anything political?" And I was like, "Yes," and he was like, "Oh, we're so sorry, and we apologize," and and now I've seen this with my generation in the Czech Republic, and to some degree with East Germans, but. What do you do if your dad really towed the party line and now his life sucks because he lost his job because he didn't really do much in the communist days? Life was easy because you can't get fired. No one's judging you on how much stuff you put out. It's just you go show up and do a little bit of work, and production famously was lacking in the socialist countries because there's just what's in it for me? I'm not gonna have a happy life. I can't get fired. I'm gonna the whole idea of workers' rights, but the whole idea behind socialism is I got all the rights. They can't fire me. I'm in the best union ever. And I still had this when I was there. I couldn't get fired. I used in Czech Republic. It's still really hard to fire somebody. And that kind of breeds laziness. I saw a lot of lazy people as kind of coasting by, and so how do they adjust? And so maybe communism wasn't so bad for them, And so there's a lot of people that do like I said, the Communist Party was voted into power when I was there, and I was like, whoa, what does this mean? Because all the old folks got together and were like, no, let's bring it back. And there was enough people out there that actually, and it was shocking. They wanted to leave the EU and stuff. I mean, it was just like, what the heck? So that still happens, and that's a horrible generation gap because the young kids are all kind of like us. But now and then, I was in a bar and you meet folks that are just, they don't know as many foreigners, or they don't, I don't want to say they're uneducated, but it's this class of people that they don't speak English. I had to have this conversation through a translator. And the guy bought all the Russian propaganda. And we were having a conversation of, how great Russia is, basically. And I was like, well, what about this and that? And it turned towards World War II. And I just had to leave. I just had to okay, stop translating to me what he's saying because I can't deal with this guy anymore. Because he had all his facts wrong. He had all his, and I know what propaganda. I know enough about the Russians, the Soviet Union, to know what he had read and what he, where he got this, but it just wasn't true. It was just, World War II was won single-handedly by the Soviet Union. We barely did anything. What about Japan? What about Japan? Was his reply. What do you mean Japan? Was Japan even in the war? It was like, they just didn't know. And
very provincial and
super crazy, just insane stories of the version of things that they are fed. Now the kids, our generation, they instantly wanted to travel. That was the big thing as well. Now we can finally go see Paris, we can finally go see London, and the first things all the kids wanted to do was get the heck out of town. And everybody did, but for kids that was really eye-opening, this is the rest of the world, I see now. Whereas for the older generation, it was, they already had their biases and they already had their belief system in place, and it's just a horrible generation gap. It really is. I can't do it justice here in this format. It's a whole nother topic. But it's heart-wrenching when you realize that families were broken apart, and then families are still broken apart today because there's arguments over, how society should proceed. The Czech Republic is still tearing each other apart over. There's neo-Nazis on the rise on the one side, but then there's also the far leftist, the communists on the rise on the other side. And unfortunately, those two extremist sides are growing and have been growing for the last couple of decades, and we see this in the elections. In East Germany and West Germany, it's still split politically. When you look at a map, you see exactly where the border was, and if you see where the FDP, the AFE, the right wing parties, where the FDP and AFD are the two big ones. If you see where they won, that's all it's all the East German states, and that's sad, and you see that a lot. And I've seen pro neo-Nazi marches and all that, and in West Germany you see them, or even Berlin you see them, and it's like 5-1 punks versus skinheads. There's just way more leftists and anarchists and that. And unfortunately, what I saw was the other way around. I saw way more skinheads than normal people, and that's sad. And that's on the rise. And that is a generation gap thing. That's the wave. That's the echo of that 40 years of tyranny. There's no other way to put it. That was 30 years ago, but we're feeling the after effects to this day. The EU and how that handles, and Russia breathing down the EU's neck. Being the bad guy again. I think it's okay to say that at this point. Russia's doing some pretty shady things. Now it's the test of time, because not all people in the Czech Republic and not all people in former East Germany are pro-EU, and there's a lot of pro-Putin folks out there. And it's not. They have not healed 100%. You still see the scars, deliberately, undeliberately. They're definitely there. You can still go to Eastern Europe, and hey, if you want to see the Soviet Union, just go to the Ukraine. It's all still there. The buildings, the lack of electricity, the lack of power, the lack of hot water. So your beer's going to be warm. If you want to know what the Soviet Union was like, the Ukraine is still there waiting for you. Don't go to Kiev or Odessa or the big cities. Go to the villages, Soviet Union is still available to tourists. Don't go to the eastern Ukraine, though, because of aforementioned Russia. But, yeah. Yeah, it really is crazy. This is one of those topics that you can still go see it. It's still... There's communist museums all around in all those countries, in Berlin and Prague and all those places. And it's still there. I want to go visit Kristaps from the eastern borders. That's on my list. I think next year might happen. And I want to fly him over here too, so we can have that conversation here. Like, I want him to show him, Silicon Valley, like the craziest part of capitalism. But I also want to go see Riga, and that was part of the former Soviet Union, and go visit. I still love that part of the world, honestly, not because communism existed there, but because it is just something else. It is. You can see the pre-war world. And then you can see a long history of troubles and totalitarianism and a lot of hard battles. So,
and as we've seen throughout our conversation, The Lives of the Others is a part of a larger genre of movies that are observing communism. There was Goodbye Lenin and a number of other movies. Overall, though, if you had to say a conclusion of this movie, The Lives of the Others, what's your final thoughts on it?
It's a very powerful movie. I think even the comedies are touching in some ways. Like, I think Goodbye Lenin it makes you feel like the end of the movie. There's it's the reunification of Germany, and there's fireworks, and there's always that part of it. There's, the end of Life of the Other had the Die Wende, the change, the fall of the wall, and, life after. And it's an awakening of the sense of like, oh, okay, you wake up and you realize that it's all just a bad dream. And like, when you watch the movie, you kind of get that. Like, at the end of the movie, there's that closure. Like, everybody's forgiven. The guy sees the book. Not everything's okay because of the girlfriend and this and that, but life goes on, and it's just even in Bonnie Clyd, which is a Czech movie that makes fun of. Bonnie Clyd was actually filmed in 1989, so it's super fresh, but making fun of communism nonetheless. And Polishki was filmed in 96, I believe, and is making fun of communism the way Goodbye Lenin is. Very similar humor, making fun of just all these different little day-to-day aspects. And still, at the end of the movie, they all have this like touching moment of like, this is like this like existential, like, this is what life is, this is what we all went through. I think Polishki, at the end has a dedication. It says, to all those that stayed, because it's the events around the Prague Spring in 1968. And it says it's to all those that stayed, because one of the characters just goes to America, and just that's the end of his nightmare. He's in America now, and he's in a better place. And here you see that, and it's just all those movies have such a powerful ending to see that like the end of East Germany happened, and now there's one Germany again, and it's what a whole generation of people wanted. For 40 years, people just like dreamed and prayed and wished for this to happen, and then it happened. So it's very powerful. But again, like all the things I said before about the generation gap and that trauma, it still exists. And I think you see all of that in the very end of that movie too. It's just very powerful. It's just like, you don't have to have lived there to know that it's a very powerful movie. It's a very powerful message, and the people affected in Berlin are like, they all have stories like this. It wasn't an easy time.
Well, I want to thank you very much, Travis, for joining me today. This was a absolutely fascinating conversation on an interesting movie, but an even more interesting topic.
Absolutely. I love talking about, if you want to hear more from my shows about this specifically, I do talk about East Germany now and that. I think I did one special on East Germany, on the history of Germany. Otherwise, Bohemican, we touch on these topics quite a bit. We deal with Czech history throughout its history, like from medieval times to Holy Roman Empire times to the Nazi days. But a lot of the things that we lived in, my co-host Pete Coleman and I, what we lived and breathed living there. Pete still lives there, by the way, so Bohemican still exists as a show. It's go listen to it. But we would see those scars, and we would talk about some of the events that happened, and every once in a while it would be in the news that this or that guy came up on corruption charges, and he used to be in the Communist Party, or it's still there. It's still interesting. So we do talk about that a lot. We talk about those stores where you could buy Western goods, and if you want to know more, we talk about this a lot on Bohemican for sure. And there's more out there. Endlessly fascinating topic. Like, oh my goodness, 40 years of that is just, yeah. You can tell I have spent some time thinking about this kind of stuff.
Thank you for listening to the Beyond the Big Screen podcast. Of course, a big thanks goes out to Travis Dow of the Podcastnik groups of podcasts, which includes The History of Germany, The History of Germany in German, The Secret Cabinet, which is a translation of a German podcast, Americana für euch, a show about Americana, if you will, for German listeners, and The History of Alchemy, Africa History, and many, many more. You can find out more about them at podcastnik.com or in the show notes. I would like to just take a quick moment for a quick correction. Throughout both parts of this episode, I referred to the main character as Wiesmann, where of course his name was Wiesler. If you'd like to learn more about Beyond the Big Screen, see show notes, and connect to the social media, go over to a2zhistorypage.com. On Facebook, find us at Beyond the Big Screen, and on Twitter, I would love to hear from you. We can talk movies, and I would definitely love to hear your ideas for shows. Please share ideas for movies to cover or guests. The email address is steve@a2zhistorypage.com. That's steve@atozhistorypage.com. If you like what you hear, I would really appreciate you leaving the show a rating and review on iTunes. Ratings and reviews really help a great deal to let me know what you think about the show and how to make the show better. We'll see you next time beyond the big screen.